Thanks, Dan. I have to say first, when we talk about multi-faith, it's a big idea. It's a big concept. But for me, when I think multi-faith, what I think about is Michael and Marcy and Tim and Justin and Hamdi and Dan and a few others. There's a story that John the 23rd of blessed memory, Pope, met with the Archbishop of Canterbury at one point, and Canterbury said to the Pope, "Do you think it's ever possible that our communions will become one again?" And the Pope said, "I don't know, but between us, it's already happened." What I want you to know when you come to this, between us, it's happening. And it is such a blessing for me to be part of this group. Thank you. So I'm not so sure that the question we've posed, why are people leaving their faith behind, makes an erroneous assumption. I think perhaps it does. The question is, are people in fact, Dan's statistics notwithstanding, are people leaving their faith behind, or are they simply leaving their churches behind? And I'm speaking as a Christian. I'll talk about churches, but of course I'm thinking about mosques and temples, synagogues, of course, as well. You know, there's no question, but as Dan said, that people in America, especially younger people, are leaving their churches, their denominations, their religious organizations. No question that church membership and church affiliation are in decline. But when I leave my church, does that mean I'm leaving my faith? Or when my understanding of God begins to evolve, when God no longer fits the old descriptions that Orthodox religion enshrines, does that mean I'm leaving my faith? I'd suggest that in most cases, or at least in many cases, the answer to those questions is no. People who are leaving what is often referred to as organized religion still have soulful questions and soulful aspirations and even a soulful faith. They still wonder about the meaning of their lives. They still believe, many of them, that there is some magnificent, unifying spirit in life. They still wrestle with ethical questions, not just from a utilitarian perspective, but from a perspective of values that are transcendent. The shorthand designation for many of these people, you all know it, is spiritual but not religious, which in my view translates to, I'm still asking the same questions, I just don't want to ask them in church. So if the question is shifted a bit to why are people leaving their churches behind, among many of the reasons that there are, I would suggest three. The first has to do with a massive, centuries-long movement toward individualism, privatism, personalism. These are the logical extensions of the essential insights of the Enlightenment for which we should always give thanks, including the insight about the value of the individual. The authority of institutions and governments and mega-organizations have been under withering assault since the 16th century, and the ascendance of personal autonomy has been a theme of Western culture all that time. For their part, the churches have not largely learned how to relate to people except through the exercise of authority. Traditions like my own, congregationalism, have ameliorated institutional authority somewhat and have replaced it with the authority of the individual conscience. But even so, the tendency of institutions is to exert control over their members, and that tendency remains strong. So the seat of religious experience has been moving inexorably from the community to the individual. The center of my religious experience is no longer worship on Sunday morning with fellow believers, but in personal meditation, in individual study, in solitary prayer, even private forms of liturgy. The second reason I'd highlight is the sluggishness of institutional theology. In a time when concepts of God are changing radically, particularly post-Holocaust, and old ideas of God are being abandoned, in a time of theological fluidity, institutions take much longer to react than individual minds. In short, the churches have not kept up with their people theologically. And I have to add that my experience here may be colored by the fact that I serve a congregation that is long on skepticism and short on unquestioning belief. The influence of some Eastern religion, particularly Buddhism, has moved many of us to think of God now in non-theistic terms. And frankly, it takes churches a long time to adapt to that kind of sea change in theological perspective and speculation. Why fight an entrenched war over theology within the church when it is much easier to simply walk out the door and strike out on my own into new theological territory? Thus, people leave their churches behind. The third and final of the reasons I'm holding up, and there are many others, of course, I'd hold up for the exodus from the churches is that the image of the church in the media and the popular imagination in America has been almost exclusively driven and owned by the right wing. That image is of theological rigidity, unrelenting negativity, homophobia, racism, anti-intellectualism, and the denigration of science. I hasten to add that this is a skewed image. It does not fairly represent the breadth of American religious values or realities, but that's not what matters. The truth is that when most Americans think about church, they think about conservative church, and they are largely unaware of the existence of a progressive religious movement that is vital and strong. Turned off by that negativity, they give up on the idea of church. So the question I'd leave you with is this: when we tire of our rampant individualism, as I expect we must one day, when we realize that it is possible to have religious community without theological sluggishness, when we realize that American Christianity is not really as negative a force as we have been led to believe, what new form will the church, will faith communities take? I fully believe that the exodus, or better phrase, the exile from church, will reverse itself. But when all of those people come home, I think home's going to look very, very different.